Wyoming Territory, August 1879. The wind came down off the Bighorn Mountains sharp and dry, sweeping dust across the trail just as Grace Lattimer stepped off the eastbound freight wagon with nothing but the threadbare dress on her back and her 2 children pressed against her sides. The town was called Hollow Creek, a cluster of weather-worn buildings, a leaning church steeple, and a saloon that echoed with laughter even in the morning. Grace squinted against the sun, holding her son Micah's hand and keeping her other arm around her daughter, May, as the teamster shouted something behind her and drove off without a second glance. She had no money, no family left, barely enough strength to stand. "Ma," Micah said, voice trembling, "where are we sleeping?" Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mouth was too dry, and her heart was beating too fast. She had begged the ride from Rawlins after walking nearly 20 miles on blistered feet, carrying May when her daughter's legs gave out. She had come here chasing a whisper of work, a friend of a friend's promise at a boarding house that, when she'd arrived, had turned out to be boarded up and abandoned. They had truly nothing now. "Excuse me," a man's voice said from behind her, low, steady. "You all right, ma'am?" Grace turned fast, shielding the children with her body out of instinct. The man standing there had sun-browned skin, a dust-covered hat in one hand, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked young, maybe 30, but there was something older in the way he held himself, like he had been through more than most men twice his age. "My name's Beau Trenton," he said gently. "I've got a place just west of town. Saw you step off the wagon. You looked lost." Grace's throat tightened. "We don't need charity." "I ain't offering charity," Beau said. "I'm offering help." Micah clutched her skirt. May leaned into her side, silent and wide-eyed. "I can pay you back," Grace said quickly. "If you've got work. I can scrub floors or cook, or I run cattle," Beau said. "I could use someone to help with meals. And I've got a spare room in the bunkhouse nobody's using." Grace hesitated. "Just one night," he added, "to get your feet under you." She looked at her children, then back at him. "All right," she said. Beau's ranch sat beneath a wide sky, surrounded by golden grass and a few stubborn cottonwoods. The house was modest but clean, and the bunkhouse was more than she expected: 4 cots, a wood stove, and a window facing the sunrise. That night, Grace tucked May and Micah into the cot beside her and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the quiet creak of the walls. She could not understand why a man like Beau, alone, clearly capable, and with no obligation to anyone, would help a stranger with nothing but 2 children clinging to her. But she was too tired to question it now. By the end of the week, Grace had cooked 6 meals, done every scrap of laundry, and stitched 2 shirts back together for Beau's ranch hand. She had also watched him from the kitchen window, moving slow and steady through his work, always with purpose. Micah followed him like a shadow, full of questions. Beau never once brushed him off. May, shy and quiet, only watched from the porch, clutching a ragged doll Grace had sewn from scraps. "You don't say much," Beau said one evening while she was peeling potatoes. "I talk when I have something worth saying," Grace replied. He smiled at that, not amused but pleased, like he liked the grit in her. "Your husband around?" he asked. "No," she said. "He left us in Kansas last winter. Took everything. I buried my parents the year before. We've been on our own since." Beau nodded, like he understood the weight of that without needing more. "Well," he said, "you ain't on your own now." Grace looked at him, then really looked, and for the first time in a long while her chest didn't feel so tight. Weeks passed. The bunkhouse became home. Grace found rhythm in the work, and the children smiled more. Micah learned to ride. May planted wildflowers near the porch. One night, after supper, Beau lifted May into the air when she ran to him with a drawing in her hand. She giggled, her cheeks pink with joy. You're good with them, Grace said, watching from the doorway. Beau looked over his shoulder. They're good kids. They've had to be. He set May down gently, his expression soft. You all have. Grace didn't say anything, but something shifted in her then, deep and quiet. It rained one afternoon in early September. A sharp, wild storm that rolled down from the mountains. Grace ran outside to pull the laundry off the line and slipped in the mud with a sharp cry. Beau was there in seconds, lifting her out of the mire like she weighed nothing. His arms were strong and warm, and his jaw was tight. You all right? He asked, voice low. I twisted it, Grace said, wincing. Not bad. He carried her inside anyway, set her down on the chair by the fire, and knelt to examine her ankle. His fingers were careful, his touch light. You do not have to do all this, she whispered. I want to, he said. Their eyes met. The room was quiet except for the rain. Grace's breath caught. That night, after the children were asleep, Beau knocked on the bunkhouse door. You need anything? He asked. She opened the door wider. Let him in. They sat by the fire, neither speaking for a long time. Then Beau said, I do not know what kind of man would walk away from you, but I ain't him. Grace looked at him, heart in her throat. I see the way you fight for them, he said. The way you hold yourself together, even when you are breaking inside. I was never trying to be strong, she said. I just did not have another choice. Beau's hand reached across, covering hers. You have one now. The next morning, Grace stood in the doorway watching the sunrise, May on her hip, Micah feeding the chickens. Beau was saddling his horse, but he stopped and turned to look at her. She smiled, and he smiled back, slow and sure. She had nothing when she came here. Now she had him, and she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was everything. The first frost came early that year, silvering the fence rails and turning the grass brittle beneath the horses' hooves. Grace pulled the children's coats tighter each morning, wrapping scarves around their necks before letting them out the door. Micah had taken to hauling wood from the pile beside the barn without being asked, and May hummed to herself as she swept the porch with a broom twice her height. Beau had built a smokehouse during the last warm days of September, and Grace helped him salt and hang strips of venison and beef, her hands red from brine. They worked in silence much of the time, but not the kind that felt cold. With Beau, quiet had a way of feeling full. Like both of them knew words were only necessary when something new had to be said. One morning, just after sunup, Beau handed her an envelope. It's from the land office, he said. Thought you ought to see it. Grace opened it slowly, frowning as she read. They're still contesting the claim? They want more documentation. Proof I've improved the east pasture. You've built a corral, planted oats. That's proof enough. Not to a man behind a desk in Cheyenne. She set the letter down, rubbing her thumb over a splinter in the table. Is there anything you want me to do? He shook his head. I'll ride out next week and set it straight. Grace watched him for a moment. You don't have to carry every burden alone. Beau folded the letter and placed it back in his coat pocket. I've been doing it so long I forgot there's another way. She didn't press him, but later, when he came in from splitting fence rails with a gash along his palm, she sat him down by the stove and stitched it herself, her hands steady even though his blood soaked through the cloth before she finished. Afterward, he didn't say thank you. He just laced his fingers through hers and held them there for a long time. That night, a coyote howled from the hills. May stirred in her sleep, and Grace rose to check the latch on the door. Outside, the moon caught on the frost, and the barn looked like something cut from glass. She found Beau sitting on the edge of the porch, coat collar turned up against the cold. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Never do when the wind shifts like this. She sat beside him, tucking her hands under her shawl. I used to think I could outwork my ghosts, he said. Grace didn't answer. She waited. Lost my brother in the Powder River fight. We were both just boys. He signed up against Pa's wishes. I followed him 6 months later. Did you see him again? Only once, and by then it was too late. She nodded slowly. My mother died the day before May was born. I remember thinking I had to carry both their weights from that moment forward. You did. Grace looked out toward the fields. I don't want to live with only grief in my hands. Beau turned to her. Then let me put something else in them. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just let the warmth of his body beside her speak what neither of them had yet said aloud. The next morning, Beau made biscuits. They were hard as fence knots, but the children ate them with honey and laughed when he tried to pretend it was on purpose. Micah dragged a stool over to watch Grace wash the dishes. Are we staying here forever, Ma? Grace dried her hands, crouched down, and brushed the hair from his brow. Would you like that? He nodded. Beau says I've got a good seat in the saddle. And May says the rooster likes her now. Grace looked out the window. Beau was mending the gate, sleeves rolled, head bent. She felt something settle inside her that had been loose for a long while. That evening, just before dusk, she brought him a cup of coffee. I've been thinking, she said. Beau set down the hammer. That usually means trouble. I want to plant beans in the spring, and maybe tomatoes. We won't have much to sell, but we can feed ourselves. He wiped his hands on a rag. You sure? I've never been surer. I want to build something that lasts. He looked at her then, long and steady, the way a man does when he's committing something to memory. I've got lumber stacked behind the barn, he said. Enough to start a proper kitchen addition. We'll need more space come next winter. Grace didn't answer, but she reached for his hand, and they stood like that until the sun dropped behind the hills and the cold crept in again. Inside the bunkhouse, she found May asleep with her doll tucked beneath her chin. Micah was snoring softly, one arm across the foot of the cot. Grace pulled the quilt higher over them, then sat down at the edge of the bed. Outside, Beau's boots crunched on the dirt as he crossed to the house, and something deep in her chest finally let go. There would be more hard days. More letters from men who didn't care about fence posts or oat fields. But she wouldn't face them alone. She had a place now, and she had him. By late October, the creek along the western edge of Beau's land had thinned to a slow trickle, its banks edged with brittle reeds and the remains of summer's green flattened under frost. Grace stood at the edge of it one morning, her hem just brushing the grass, a basket of linens in her arm. She didn't come for the water. She came for the stillness. Behind her, the ranch stirred with the sounds of morning hooves against packed earth, the low call of cattle, the scrape of metal on wood from the forge Beau had built during the last warm spell. But here, the hush of the land allowed her thoughts room to breathe. She heard a rider approach before she saw him. The hoofbeats were uneven, one horse, favoring its front leg. She turned as Beau came into view, leading a bay gelding with a limp and a saddle cinched loose. Through a stone, he said as he dismounted. Didn't notice fast enough. Grace knelt beside the horse, her fingers working gently along its leg. He'll walk it off if you keep him from running. Let me wrap it. Beau crouched beside her, watching her tie strips of muslin with practiced hands. You always know what to do, he said. I had to learn, she replied. After Ma died, there wasn't anyone else to stitch Pa's hand when he caught it on barbed wire. You get good at things when you don't have a choice. Beau didn't speak for a while, just watched her finish the knot and stroke the gelding's neck. You've got a way with hurt things, he said finally. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her palms. That horse isn't hurt. He's healing. He nodded once, then reached into his coat pocket and held something out to her. It was a hair comb, simple, carved from pale wood, its teeth smoothed by use. The design etched along the top was rough but careful. A row of prairie flowers not yet in bloom. "I made it from the maple by the corral," he said. "Thought your hair deserved something better than string and pins." Grace took it, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you. I know it ain't much." "It is," she said, her voice low. "It's the first thing anyone's given me in years just because they wanted to." That night she wore the comb. Not for show, there was no one to impress on a ranch tucked miles from anything but horizon, but because he'd made it, and because it fit in her hair like it had always belonged there. He noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes paused on her when she came in from the cold, cheeks wind flushed, a bit of snow caught in her lashes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The next day the weather turned. Snow came in thick and fast, and the wind howled hard enough to rattle the shutters. Beau brought Micah into the barn with him to show him how to brace the beams against the gusts. Grace watched from the doorway, May curled against her chest, small hands tucked into her mother's apron. That evening, the children curled on the rug near the stove, drawing in the ash with burnt sticks. Grace sat by the hearth, darning socks, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Beau poured a mug of coffee and passed it to her. "I spoke to the man at the feed store last time I rode into town," he said. "He heard about a schoolhouse getting built near Powder Creek. Might be open by spring." Grace looked up. "That's a day's ride. Closer than the next one. I figured maybe Micah could ride in once a week. I could take him." She folded the sock in her lap. "You already do more than I ever imagined. I want a life with you, Grace. Not just a roof and meals shared. I want to build something that lasts." She set the sock aside and reached for his hand. "Then let's build it." Their fingers curled together, warm and sure. The children's laughter rose behind them, soft and high. That night, after the fire had burned low and the wind quieted against the walls, Grace stepped outside. The snow had stopped. The stars blinked through the clouds, and the land stretched wide and white beneath them. Beau joined her a moment later, blanket draped over his shoulders, boots crunching softly behind her. "I used to think peace was a thing for other people," she said. "Folks born into it." Beau's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. "It's not something you're given. It's something you make." She leaned into him, her head against his chest, his heartbeat slow and steady under her ear. "I want this," she said. "All of it. You." The children laughing. The mornings with frost on the windows. "I want every bit of this life." "You've got it," he said. "For as long as you want it." She turned in his arms, looked up at him. "I'll never stop." He kissed her, then quiet, reverent, nothing rushed. Just the truth of what had grown between them, wordless and whole. Come spring, the beans would go in the ground. The schoolhouse would open. The comb would stay on her nightstand, and the gelding would run again. And Grace, who once carried nothing but her children and the weight of survival, would wake each morning beside a man who had given her his everything and called it love. Snow held to the ridgelines well into November. The drifts crusted over hard at night and softened just enough in the afternoon to make walking a careful thing. Grace had taken to boiling water in the mornings and setting it in a stoneware bowl by the bunkhouse door, so May could warm her hands before eating her bread. Micah had grown lean from chores, his coat pulled tighter across the shoulders than it had weeks before. Grace stitched a new one from wool Beau traded for salt blocks and seed. She worked on it at night after the children slept, her stitches neat and close, shoulders aching from the day's labor. She didn't tell anyone when her fingertips split from the cold. She simply wrapped them in linen and kept sewing. One evening, as the last light slanted through the windows and turned the bunkhouse golden, Beau stepped inside with a bundle under one arm. "I found this tucked in the loft," he said. "Old but sound." Grace unfolded the quilt slowly. The fabric smelled of cedar and thyme. Each square had been stitched by hand, the corners precise. Her hand hovered over one patch faded to pale blue. "Did your mother make this?" she asked. He shook his head. "My grandmother. She raised my father after his own folks died of fever. I reckon she'd be glad to know it's warming someone again." Grace looked up, the weight of the gift pressing against her chest. "You sure you want to part with it?" "I'm sure I want you to have it." She didn't say thank you. She just folded the quilt again and placed it atop the cot where May would sleep that night. Later, while Micah read aloud from a worn almanac and May colored with chalk on a scrap of slate, Grace leaned against the doorframe and watched Beau run a whetstone along his knife. His motions were slow, almost meditative. "You always sharpen your tools the same way," she said. He paused, glancing up. "Habit. I can tell. You use the same number of strokes every time." Beau set the knife aside and wiped the blade clean. "I learned from a man who said the day you stop respecting your tools is the day you start making mistakes." Grace stepped outside, boots crunching softly on the packed snow. Beau followed, drawing his coat tighter. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said. "The one who made the quilt. She came west with nothing but a borrowed wagon and a mule that died before they reached Nebraska. She married a blacksmith, bore 7 children, buried 4 of them before they could walk. She could read Greek and fix a wagon axle with her bare hands." Grace nodded slowly. "Sounds like someone who didn't flinch." "She didn't," Beau said. "And she didn't let anyone else either." They stood quietly after that, shoulders brushing. Grace turned her face toward the wind, eyes scanning the horizon. "What do you see when you look out there?" she asked. "Land that's mine, but only because I show up every morning and work it." "What do you see?" She hesitated. "A place that's forgiven me for surviving." Beau's breath came out slow. "You never needed forgiveness." "I did," Grace said. "For staying when I should have left. For believing a man would change when he only got meaner." His hand rested gently at the small of her back. "You left when it counted. I waited too long." "You got out," Beau said. "You saved your children. You saved yourself. That's what counts." Grace looked down at her boots. "Sometimes I think I don't know how to be loved without owing something in return." "You don't owe me anything," Beau said. "Not ever." She lifted her gaze to his, and something in her face softened. She stepped closer, enough to feel the warmth of him through her coat. "You're the first man who's ever told me that," she said. Beau reached up, brushing a strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. "You're the only woman I've ever wanted to say it to." They didn't kiss. Not then. But Grace rested her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she wasn't something fragile to protect, but something strong to stand beside. The next morning, Grace rose before the sun and started bread for the week. May stirred in her sleep, and Micah muttered something and rolled over, but she moved quietly, working by lantern light. The dough stuck stubbornly to the bowl, and she leaned into the kneading like it meant something more than bread. When Beau stepped into the kitchen, he was buttoning his shirt, hair still damp from melted snow. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low enough not to wake the children. "When the thaw comes, we'll need to dig a new root cellar. The old one's begun to sag." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "We'll do it together." Beau nodded. "I'd like that." She poured him coffee, and they sat in silence, the morning still wrapped in shadows. Grace watched the light grow behind the mountains, slow and gold. "I want to build a table," she said after a while. "One big enough for the 4 of us." He looked over at her, eyes steady. "We'll need more chairs." Grace smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. Outside, the sky cracked open to dawn, and the frost began to melt from the window panes. The thaw arrived in slow, stubborn shifts. It began with the creek swelling a little higher each morning, the ice pulling back in long, clear sheets. Then the earth softened, letting the children's boots sink in, and the scent of wet pine drifted down from the hills. Beau had started measuring planks behind the barn for the cellar walls, and Grace had gathered seed packets from the cupboard, laying them across the table in careful rows, fingering the worn paper like it told the future. One morning, Micah came in from feeding the hens with a cut on his brow. "I was trying to fix the latch on the coop," he said, eyes darting toward Beau. Beau crouched beside him, cleaning the scrape with a cloth soaked in boiled water. "You're not in trouble," he said. "But next time, ask me to show you the right way." Micah's mouth tightened. "I want to be useful." "Being useful don't mean doing everything yourself," Beau said. "It means knowing when to ask for help, too." Grace stood at the stove, stirring cornmeal into a pot. She didn't speak, but her back eased a little. She hadn't asked Beau to step into that role. He simply had. Later that week, while Micah and May picked rocks from the garden rows, Beau brought Grace a box from the wagon shed. "Found these tucked behind a broken crate," he said. "Thought you might want them." Inside were 2 chipped porcelain bowls, a bundle of linen napkins, and a book of poems with its spine split clean down the middle. She ran her hand over the cover. "These belong to your mother?" "No," he said. "They belonged to me once. Before." She looked up, waiting. "I used to read that book out loud before the war, when I was too young to know what I'd carry back with me." Grace turned a page, the print faint in places. "You kept them all this time." "I didn't have much else that felt like mine." She traced the edge of the bowl. "You can still have things that feel like yours, even now." Beau leaned a hip against the table, watching her. "I don't want anything that doesn't include you in it." The quiet that settled between them was full, not heavy. "Then you have it," she said. They didn't touch, not yet, but the promise was there, as real as the sun rising over the hills each morning. By mid-April, the soil was ready. Grace planted in long rows, her knees damp from the earth. Beau built a frame for beans to climb, and Micah carried buckets from the creek, proud of the calluses forming along his palms. May tucked flower seeds into the corners of the garden, whispering to them like they could hear. One afternoon, a rider came down the road from town. He carried a letter with a seal from the land office. Beau opened it slowly, reading it once, then again. "They've confirmed the claim," he said. "It's ours. No more questions." Grace didn't answer at first. She took the letter, read it herself, and then looked up at him. "What now?" Beau glanced toward the bunkhouse, where May's dress hung on the line and Micah's boots stood drying by the door. "We build the rest of it together." That night, while the children slept, Grace stepped into the main house with a folded bundle in her arms. "I've had enough nights apart," she said. Beau didn't answer. He just pulled the quilt from the cedar chest and laid it across the bed, and when they lay down side by side, he held her like she had always been meant to fit there. The next morning, May woke first and padded into the main room, her hair tangled from sleep. She crawled into the middle of the bed between them and curled up without a word. Beau pulled the quilt over her. Grace smiled. By summer, the root cellar was finished. The table was built from pine Beau had hauled from a nearby mill, its surface wide enough for all 4 of them. Grace made pickled beans and blackberry preserves and stored them on the shelves Beau had lined with cedar planks. Micah built a kite from old flour sacks, and Beau taught him how to catch wind in it. May helped Grace press wildflowers between the pages of the book of poems. One clear afternoon, Grace stood in the garden, watching the children chase each other between the rows. Beau came to stand beside her, his sleeves rolled, his hands calloused and clean. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "You didn't find it," Grace said. "You built it." He looked at her, the sun catching the edge of his jaw. "I'm asking you now, as plain as I can. Will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. Yes. They were wed under the cottonwood by the stream, with only the children and the wind as witnesses. Grace wore a dress she'd stitched from muslin Beau had traded for in town. Micah stood tall beside Beau, and May held Grace's hand, her fingers wrapped tight. There was no preacher, only words spoken quiet and true. Beau slid a silver band onto Grace's finger, one he'd shaped himself in the forge, the inside etched with a single date. Afterward, they shared bread and wild honey under the sky. May picked flowers for the table, and Micah played a tune on the harmonica Beau had carved from bone and maple. That night, Grace stood in the doorway of their home, watching the last of the light slip behind the hills. Beau came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I used to think peace was silence," he said. "But it's this. You, them. A life that doesn't need to be earned, only tended." Grace leaned back into him. "We'll tend it together." Inside, the fire crackled low, supper still warm on the hearth, and laughter echoed from the children's room. Outside, the stars blinked open, slow and sure, over a world that had finally made room for them all.